Good evening and welcome to the Reading League Michigan's presentation of Dr. Adria Truckenmiller Science of Writing. Thank you for joining us, Adria. And we just ask that you consider joining the Reading League Michigan as we continue our advocacy for the science of reading, science of writing, evidence-based practices, getting them out to all stakeholders, from teachers to parents to businesses, anyone that is interested and dedicated to encouraging literacy across the state of Michigan. And one of those great advocates for literacy from writing to reading is Dr. Truckenmiller, and we thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Rebecca. I am just thrilled to be here, and even more so that all of you have joined us on a Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock. I am floored and beyond impressed with all that you are juggling with schools and your job and families and all the other demands that are being placed on educators right now. It is truly a unique and stressful time, and the fact that you want to engage in this discussion, I'm really excited. It's a very unique niche of people that are here today. So what we'll talk about tonight, thanks to all of you who attended the first session and were brave enough to come back for the second session. I'm just going to give a brief overview of our journey. So we're focusing on 5 different aspects of a empirical model of writing. The last session, we talked about overall writing quality and the discourse level of language that's needed for students to grow and develop in their writing achievement. Today, we're going to talk about executive functions. I've renamed this because I've learned some things, and when we learn new things, we do them. So prior to tonight, I'd called this working memory and attention, but I realize that's a misnomer, so I will show you why later. So tonight's executive functions. In December, we'll talk about the inferencing, theory of mind, and monitoring components. In January, we'll talk about the language components at the word and sentence level, vocabulary and syntax. And then finally, I saved my favorite for the last in February, when we'll talk about transcription, spelling, handwriting, and keyboarding. And all of these components, as a very quick review from last session, are coming from Dr. Young-Suk Kim's direct and indirect effects of writing model, which she has been gathering a lot of really strong empirical evidence for over the past few years, with her initial publication in 2017, one in 2019, and then a super hot off the presses publication in 2021 that was just released a couple of weeks ago in the Journal of Educational Psychology. But I like this one from 2019. I think it is easier to wrap your head around. And so we're going through, last time Dr. Kim amazingly walked us through the whole model. And then we talked about this upper level of the model last week, how mostly focusing on how we can instruct this piece, but also having a good conceptualization of what that looks like and how that's defined. This week, we're going to look at this base of the model. So this is our indirect effects. Indirect effects meaning that the executive functions that we talk about tonight influence students' abilities to use their lexical level skills and their abilities to use their oral language skills to create written composition and reading. So we're going to focus on that this week. And then the following sessions will hit these other 3 pieces. So that's your cognitive model to hold in your brain to think about where each of these things plug in. That's the big picture. So let's dive right in to those executive functions. First, let's start with our agenda for today. We'll start with definitions of executive functions. We'll do a couple of fun demonstrations of what these executive functions look like. Then we'll dive into, I think, your favorite part and mine, what we can do in instruction that actually has an impact on that executive function piece. And then we're going to talk about how this is similar to or integrated with reading. And finally, we'll have lots of time for you to ask some burning questions that you brought with you after thinking too much about our first session. Hopefully you have some questions from there. We'll be happy to roll back to that and answer it. And then many of you engaged in the writing assignment that was the homework from last session. So one of the key things that Karen Harris talks about that's so effective in both professional learning about writing development and writing instruction that occurs in the classroom is when educators engage in writing themselves and are self-cognizant, metacognizant of the processes that they use to engage in the writing process, and the struggle of the writing process is really helpful. So that exercise serves two functions. One, to help all of us get into the struggle of writing ourselves, and then also to be able to think about how these different concepts and different components play into this complex puzzle of writing. So let's start with the executive functions that are critical for writing. So for a while, before I went to FCRR and before I got into literacy almost exclusively, I actually worked as a neuropsych technician doing neuropsychological evaluations for children with brain injury in Syracuse, where the Reading League is headquartered. And during that time, I learned a whole bunch about executive functions. There are many executive functions that are engaged in by the frontal lobes of our brains. But there are three particular ones that we want to pay attention to in writing. And this is actually really exciting and somewhat new-ish that we've nailed down which three executive functions play the largest role in writing. And mostly we get this actually from the reading research. So there's a brand new meta-analysis that's cited at the bottom of this slide on these three executive functions that in meta-analysis have been shown to be linked to reading and math performance. And then a prior meta-analysis found these, and this one added, this one added language as well. So a prior meta-analysis just did reading and math. This one added language, which we know underlies both reading and writing. So anyway, the three we're going to focus on: inhibitory control, working memory, and set shifting. So I'll just read the definitions here, and then we're going to look at a solid example so that you can really wrap your mind around it. Inhibitory control. This is typically what we think about in a profile of ADHD. So, or our dogs in our house, when they see a squirrel, whatever they were focused on, they can't focus on it anymore because there's something else that's dominating their response patterns. Working memory. This is the piece of memory where we hold chunks of information and manipulate those chunks of information and update our chunks of information with new data that we get from reading or from our environment. And we manipulate the information. How many chunks of information can we manipulate at one time? This is, of course, limited for all humans, not just people who have a disability that affects their executive functions. So set shifting is the ability to switch attention between two different sets, and then which requires the mental capacity to quickly engage and disengage from certain aspects of the task, from the first set moving into the second set, and then moving back into the first set or another set. All of these words are intentionally precise because and academic vocabulary so that they can fit all of the possible tasks that could go into this. So let's look more closely at specific examples. So general executive functions, starting with working memory. One of the most common ways to isolate our working memory abilities is to do an activity called backwards digit span. Many of you may be already familiar with this, but we're going to practice it. We're going to try it out. So in your head, I'm going to say a string of numbers to you, and I want you to tell them back to me, but tell them back to me in reverse order. The numbers are 5, 9, 4, 0, 2, 6. Were you able to say 6, 2, 0, 4, 9, 5? So you can see, if you were metacognitively monitoring the processes that you're using, that you're probably repeating the numbers forward and then putting them backwards. Another thing that many of you might have thought to do is to quote unquote cheat by writing down those numbers. And you know what? That's not cheating, that's smart, because you are externalizing your working memory. You're putting your working memory, you're putting it out of your mind so that you can go back to it and free up some of your working memory space, which is a really critical thing that we want to do during instruction. So for those of you who did that, good for you. You're already thinking in the, how can we help externalize working memory and free up working memory space that might be limited, because it's limited for every human. All right, the next one is inhibitory and attention control. And in this, you'll notice I added the word attention. And while we can measure attention separately from inhibitory control, we can't measure inhibitory control without an attention component. So every time that there's an inhibitory control task, it also requires the person's attention. So you'll often see attention thrown in there as well. It's not exactly the same construct, but they almost always go hand in hand. So an example of a continuous performance task, and there's lots of these out there. One example of one is a computer program where they flash animals on the screen, and the person who's taking the task, they'll be asked to press a specific button every time they see an animal, except when the animal is a pig. And so you try to do this as fast as you can. And what you notice is that there's differences in people's inhibitory control, because they'll be clicking like the space bar so quickly when it's a animal for every single time something pops on the screen, and they might accidentally hit it when a pig shows up. So it's about that ability for us to quickly inhibit the dominant response, which is hitting the key, when there's the thing you're not supposed to press the button for. So this is a contrived task, but you can sort of see how it relates to other things in life. And then the final one for shifting, the typical, one of the typical ways to measure shifting is through something called trail making. Is everybody seeing a YouTube video on my screen? Yes. Okay, so trail making, this is a typical, so this is shifting sets. The directions for this are for the person taking the test to click the numbers in order, alternating with the letters in alphabetical order. So you have to shift between doing a counting task, 1 through 12, and an alphabet task, A through K. So this is what it would look like. So you can see how you would have, how takes some working memory to shift between sets, but as well as you have to keep track of where you are in that different mental set, whether you're in the counting or the alphabetical. So you might be saying, okay, I can see how this applies to some of our behaviors. How does this apply to writing? So typically in writing, all three of these things are working simultaneously, and they tend to group together as a single factor in our empirical models as well. They also, you can also see this. So if you think about when you wrote your essay for this week, when you were writing that essay and coming up with the next line to write while you're writing, what I noticed how these applied to what I was writing was that I was simultaneously thinking about a couple of different things. I was thinking about what was the next idea I was going to write? How did it fit in with the structure of the whole essay? While I was simultaneously thinking of how to construct the sentence, the specific sentence that was talking about the one part of the idea that I was on at that point in time, and then choosing the most precise vocabulary word and how to spell that. So you can see all of these things taking up working memory. I was trying to inhibit thinking about the next idea that I wanted to write about while I was concentrating on the current idea, but also shifting between a whole bunch of different things. So you can see all of the pieces that really take up our executive functions and why it requires a lot of concentration within those executive functions. Okay, so this actually might be a great time to take a couple of comments in the chat, or if anybody wants to come off of mute, if you noticed anything about using executive functions while you were writing your essay.
I would say part of like the attention control and the inhibitory response. I just remember feeling like I had the whole big idea in my head, and I was exactly what you said. I was trying to stay focused on the one idea, and you know what else kept popping in? The time, because it said 15 minutes. So I kept like looking, I kept thinking about the time, and I was trying to shut that down at the same time as was writing, but I was moving forward. Like, what can I really get done in 15 minutes? Because I don't know that I've written straight through for 15 minutes in a really long time. So I'm really connecting to that moment.
That's awesome. Yeah, Betsy, thank you for talking about evaluating each sentence as you go. That's a huge part of this and a big part of writing. So we're always engaging in that process of reviewing, which means rereading the sentence we just wrote, and revising. Is that what I meant to say? That's one of the things I wrestle with the most when I read back my sentence. I'm like, that is not what I meant to say or what I had in my head. So yeah, we're shifting between writing, reviewing, and revising quite a bit in the writing process. And that's borne out in Hayes and Flowers models, if anybody's familiar with those models, where they focused a lot on those components. Thank you both for sharing those. That's really helpful to think about. A lot going on when kids are asked to write in that short 15-minute period of time. So let's dive into instruction. What can we do that will mediate this executive function demand for writing? So I'm going to provide some non-examples and some examples. So there's a ton of things out there. There's a lot that advertises that they will help cognitive functions. So executive functions fall within this broader umbrella of cognitive functioning, which includes a whole bunch of other things, including IQ and other cognitive functions. So I'm sure all of you may have seen on TV commercials for brain games, computerized brain games that claim to improve your IQ or keep your mental stamina, or I've seen lots mostly for keeping mental acuity as you get older. I don't know about the research on that specific aspect, but I can tell you there was an amazing meta-analysis conducted in Europe by Monica Melby-Lervog and Chuck Hume, where they looked at all of these brain games that purported to improve executive functions, expand your working memory, directly take that limited capacity working memory that we all have and expand it. And so much to the vendor's chagrin, the findings of this large meta-analysis found pretty robustly that many of these did tend to have small immediate effects on verbal working memory, but then later working memory, when people were tested on their working memory later, those effects went to 0. And then also the generalization of those effects on reading achievement were also 0. So most of these studies were conducted with students with ADHD, a population for whom the executive functions are a challenge for them. And so this meta-analysis found very robustly there was no generalization to reading achievement. So I thought that was a fascinating thing, especially as we're always bombarded with, we want to try anything to help our students, especially when they struggle. And that's certainly a feeling that we can all commiserate and empathize with. And the research tends to say that these things do not have an effect. So let's see what can we plug in instead of those things. And one way I think about this is that Cognitive abilities can change ever so slightly over very, very, very long periods of time, but attempts to change cognitive abilities with classroom instruction is really not the direction that we have the most evidence for. So I think about instead of directly trying to change our working memory, we can more effectively indirectly approach our working memory by reducing the load on our executive functions and reducing the load on working memory. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. Last session, we talked about self-regulated strategy development as this instructional method that had very, very, very large effect sizes on writing achievement. Really one of the most robust findings in education. And we talked about a couple of the reasons why we know it works last session, and the reasons that it worked is because it looked at self-regulation, which was that top layer of our model, of our theoretical model. It really addressed that self-regulation piece really well. It really addresses the structure, the overall text structure of what needs to go in a writing essay and helps students to get there. There are other components of self-regulated strategy development that I think address this executive function piece and also contributes to its success. Now, I'm telling you these pieces as correlational evidence, not as causational evidence, because we don't have any studies that show a mechanistic relationship that SRSD influences students' writing through the executive function piece. So I'm putting that caveat out there to say that this is not evidence-based, but it's more like an ESSA level 4, where we have a good theory to say, hey, these constructs that are being addressed in self-regulated strategy development are likely addressing the executive function processes that are needed in writing. So the things that I think can't be left out of instruction, because they really line up theoretically very nicely with the executive functioning pieces of the model, are these 3 components of SRSD. And those would be having this strategy for planning out the whole response. So that's putting the working memory external on the piece of paper, right? Where do I have to get to in this essay? Well, I have quick notes of where it needs to get to. So I've put my working memory on the page so that I don't need to devote my, my brain power to that while I'm writing. So that's externalizing working memory. Mnemonic device. A mnemonic device is also helpful, right? You see most of these strategies in SRSD. We're going to look at TIDE tonight. And so TIDE stands for topic, sentence, and then the I stands for something, and the D stands for something, and the E stands for something. So we reduce this working memory load by using a mnemonic. And then we also address attention and inhibitory control by having goals. So before writing, you would set a goal for how you're going to do that. Let's see what these can look like within SRSD so that you can do that. Before I show you what those look like, there's 2 other aspects that indirectly help our working memory, and we'll talk about those in following months. So of course, fluent transcription. If you think about, maybe even if you're just planning, trying to make notes about where you're going with your plan, that requires you have pretty quick handwriting and decent enough spelling that's not going to trip you up from making that plan. actually taxing your working memory. And then also strategic translation, being able to quickly come up with the vocabulary words, the sentence structure, and the discourse structure ideas that you want. So we'll look at those in later sessions, but let's dive into what do these 3 features of SRSD physically look like. So here's on the left, this is the graphic organizer, the work ahead plan with the mnemonic in it. So here we have a good graphic organizer for writing an informational text, just like you did for your writing assignment for this month. So you can think about how having this to plan ahead of time, or maybe you used your own graphic organizer when you did your project. Anybody thumbs up if you used a graphic organizer when you did your writing for this week? Got a couple. All right, that's awesome. So here's one very specific to informational writing. And I got all of these materials downloaded for free from thinksrsd.com. You can go there too and download this and all kinds of other materials for free as well. So you would start out with make sure we have this topic introduction. And then I'm organizing the rest of my essay by making sure I have 3 pieces of important evidence. And then I'm detailing my examination of that very specific piece of important evidence. And then I'm going to have a good ending to wrap it all up. So this is that advanced planning, putting your working memory on a piece of paper so that you can just look back at it after you've completed several sentences to remind you of where you're going and not get lost on a tangent. I don't know about you, but when I write, I find myself, especially when I'm getting into my detailed examination of certain evidence, I will go off on a tangent on another point. I need to use my inhibitory control to come back to my advanced planner and say, nope, that's not what this paper is about. I've got to go move to my next plan, my forward motion and writing to my next piece of evidence. So another piece of that to keep motivating and keep on that direct path on the right, doing that inhibitory control. One of the big pieces that Karen Harris indicates is really powerful in SRSD is the goal setting component. So before a student sits down to write their essay, and after they've been taught and they've practiced and used the tied mnemonic, they will set a goal for their essay that they're writing. They will set a goal for how many of these components and how well they're using these components. And they'll keep track of it over multiple essays. So this chart on the right is just a very basic grid where you would imagine each column being a different writing session or a different writing essay, where the child decides, okay, they might do a baseline or they might not, but let's say they did a baseline. They said, okay, last time I had one idea and a halfway decent ending, and I had some good vocabulary words. So they would fill in, like color in the bar, or they might use actual points for older kids, give themselves points on how well they did on these things, and then keep track over time to watch their total points go up, or the number of boxes colored in would go up. You'll also often see on the Think SRSD website, you'll see a lot of rockets. They use pictures of rockets where the kids will color in what they've done to meet their goals. And so this goal setting's, I think, really addressing those executive function pieces. I'm excited to see a question in the chat. Oh, excellent. It's a great question from the expert in SRSD herself. She says, should we target executive function via text structure and build underlying linguistic skills at the same time? Will teaching TIE lighten the load enough that students can then focus on writing with better syntax? I've read text structure moves more easily, syntax much slower to grow. How much time to dedicate to both when time is so limited? This is a really fascinating question that I've actually been spending a lot of time thinking about myself. So I'm so glad Dr. Laud brought it up. And I think about this text structure, tied goal setting piece as like a top-down approach, teaching the higher level, top level writing components, and then teaching the syntax, spelling, lower order skills as a bottom-up approach. And the conclusion that I've come to after reading a ton of both developmental skill development as well as the intervention research, and I think the intervention research informs us a lot more, is that you absolutely have to have the higher order piece of it in the instruction. Because the instruction with solely using those lower order skills has smaller impacts and may only have isolated impacts. So I agree with both the top-down and bottom-up approach. I think you need both. And for some students, especially students with disabilities and those students who struggle with the lower order skills, especially transcription, those have to be taught because they're totally constraining the student's ability to do the higher order pieces. So you've got to dedicate some time to that as well. So I think I'm not going to use the word balance. I'm going to strike that word from my vocabulary. I think it is both, right? And it's the amount of time that you spend on each. So I love Carol Connor's work in reading, where she has, I think of it as like a slider of the amount of time. So she looks at code-focused instruction and meaning-focused instruction and uses different percentages of time for code-focused versus meaning-focused instruction. I think a similar approach would translate well to writing instruction, though we don't have exact data on that, but having this kind of slider idea of, okay, most kids they all need some percentage of this higher order skill instruction. And then it's just about kind of figuring out what level of lower order skill instruction they also need and what percentage that is, which is the impossible question. So thanks for asking that. All right, so those are what the instructional pieces look like. Before I move off of the instruction, are there any other questions that people want to put in the chat, or please feel free to come off mute and ask your question. All right, we'll have lots of time for questions at the end too. So please feel free to, as your questions come up, type them into the chat. Let's move on to our last component of the evening, which is to talk about how these things are similar to reading. So there are the models, the empirical models of reading and writing both have these three executive functions within them. And these three executive functions show direct effects on students' ability to read and write, as well as indirect effects, because they affect how we choose what words we're going to use, our vocabulary, how we construct our sentences, our syntax. And so it has both of these effects, the indirect and the direct. And these two meta-analyses on these three executive functions find that the direct effects of executive functions are larger in early elementary grades and smaller in later elementary grades. And then in the later elementary grades, we tend to see higher indirect effects for these pieces. So that I highly encourage, if you are interested in more information, really diving into understanding these constructs really well, and the kind of the minute ways that they influence reading, math, and language, to read these two meta-analyses. This Spiegel meta-analysis, this one includes language. The Peng Peng's meta-analysis does not include the language piece. So I think the Spiegel one is a little bit more important for what we think about writing, because it does include those oral language components that underlie both reading and writing. And then our favorite friend, Dr. Kim, also has an article in the Journal of Educational Psychology in 2019, where she empirically tested a very similar model for reading. And if you look closely, you will see so many similarities from what we saw in the direct and indirect effects of writing model. So you see across the top layer, there's these self-regulation or socio-emotional components that are reciprocal with overall measurement of reading comprehension, this discourse level ideation and content knowledge that we saw in writing becomes background knowledge that we draw upon when we're doing reading comprehension, but still also this knowledge of how discourse is structured at the discourse level. We still have these same blocks in the middle where there's the orthography of print and the phonology of print and the morphology of print, individual words, as well as the foundational language skills, which are vocabulary and syntax, that are mediated by inferencing, reasoning, perspective taking, comprehension monitoring, goes into this. And then our bottom layer, again, are these same three executive functions. And so next time you're reading a text and trying a complicated text, let's say you're reading Dr. Kim's 2019 article or the Spiegel et al. Meta-analysis on working memory, and you're trying to really understand those words and complex academic language syntax that are being used in those articles. You can kind of metacognitively monitor how you're using these processes in your own reading comprehension of that. And then, of course, we know from all of the other amazing sessions that the Reading League and Michigan Reading League conduct how to assess and instruct these different areas for reading. Now, the key thing is, okay, these constructs are very similar, share some similar pieces, in reading as they do writing, so we can generalize our thinking a little bit about that. But then the real difference comes in instruction. And we do know that there has to be very dedicated instruction to both pieces, to both reading and writing, because the studies tend to show that these are separable in terms of the instructional practices that we need to engage in. But that doesn't mean that they don't have some influence on each other. So we have some great meta-analyses showing that writing instruction can impact reading comprehension. And so this instructional time that you're using in the writing process is very valuable. It is not wasted time that you're squirreling away from reading. It does have this residual impact on reading comprehension as well. It's just not as high as an impact as really high quality reading instruction practices. And then vice versa. So students who are good readers tend to pick up writing more quickly. However, they do need direct instruction in writing to be able to do that. Okay, so we've got about 13 minutes left of this hour. I would love to hear any questions you have remaining on executive functions, but to also answer any burning questions that you might have thought about when we got off this really dynamic and interesting session last month. Also thinking about your writing process as you engaged in that activity over this past month. Did you notice the discourse level, maybe strategies that you were using, or how you were thinking about the construction of your whole text? Maybe some self-regulatory pieces that you used. I am always so bad at the self-regulation pieces, and find that to be one of my biggest struggles with writing. Is I will write a whole paragraph. I will take 30 minutes to write that whole paragraph, and I will be really upset about how bad that paragraph was, and that it took me 30 minutes to write it. But there's really great, in SRSD, they have these really great self-regulation pieces of convincing yourself that you're a good writer, you have good ideas, getting something on the page is the first step, setting goals to actually have some sense of accomplishment. Lots of times I start my writing out of, today I'm going to write 250 words. They can be any 250 words. It doesn't matter how bad they are. Just have to get 250 words on the page. When you get 250 words on the page, you completed your goal. So that's a good self-regulatory, self-reinforcement piece that makes writing a little bit less aversive. Did anybody notice anything like that while they were writing at that discourse level or that self-regulatory level?
What keeps coming to mind for me, Adria, is it's really thinking from the instructor point of view from as a teacher. This is so foreign, genuinely so foreign as far as instruction, particularly when I think about the processes that teachers have access to and understand. Just this conversation, self-regulation, what it might look like for a student, setting the goals, is not even anywhere on a radar. maybe the closest thing to instruction that from particularly this session that I see is the concept of a graphic organizer. But even that, they might be more cutesy depending upon, it's not that we're building a metacognitive framework for them, right? Or some sort of framework for students. And then the idea of taking it from that graphic organizer into the writing, I think this self-regulation pieces come into play. Teachers recognize it, but it has never been introduced that this is part of instruction and there's a way to mediate that. So I think it's just so interesting when we think about where teachers are. I'm just kind of wondering for any of our people that are online that are actually have taught recently, is this completely new to them?
That's a great question. Oh my gosh. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so we have everybody's bigger so we can hear people talk. I'm super excited that Julie Bremer actually just weighed in on the chat. And I'm wondering if I can invite Julie to answer your question, Rebecca, because she has taught SRSD in Michigan schools and tried to integrate it into and taking on this challenge of what you're talking about. Julie, are you able to, or are you in a place that you're not able to do that? Maybe she stepped away for a second. So yeah, because I see she said in her chat, she uses a lot of positive self-talk. And I know Julie's engaging in this right now with her writing her dissertation too. So she's having to do this with her own writing. But yeah, Rebecca, I don't know what to do with that. The set shifting, right? Moving from where we were to the next one. Any other people on the call, any thoughts about Rebecca's really provoking question?
I think for me, when I started using SRSD, I bought in really quickly because I saw how effective it was. But I did sort of just get lucky in the sense that I had this PD along the way pretty early in my career. And so for me, I saw a lot of benefit quickly. And as I worked with colleagues, they did as well. But it to this point almost has to catch on to some degree, or you have to make a connection along the way.
Yeah, that personal connection, I find for me, that's what changes my behaviors. Mm-hmm. Betsy, do you mind if I ask where you teach?
I teach in Massachusetts.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yes. So I am, I'm at the elementary level, and I also teach at a community college using SRSD. So I've seen it across many grades.
Wow, that's really exciting.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that last slide, I think it was the last slide, in terms of the executive function pieces as students age. And I was actually wondering if in your estimation, that is developmental in terms of literacy. So I have students who come in at the community college level who might be new to the country and new to the language, and whether or not that would necessarily, the self-regulation pieces of SRSD work quite well with those students. But they're coming in at a developmental place of acquiring language and making meaning of it. So I see the same effects for the self-regulation pieces for those students.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, for all humans, our executive functions are limited, right? Yeah. there is a finite capacity, no matter who we are, where we are in our developmental trajectory, no matter what our environmental impacts are. So I have limited perspective just from the research, but it seems like your perspective teaching at the college level with those different levels of development.
Yeah.
Speak to that. Rebecca, did you want to repeat your question? I think Dr. Laud would like to respond to it.
I'll try. I'm not sure I remember it fully and completely how I said it, but what was really resonating with me is thinking about the fact that teachers, I don't even know that teachers would know to ask these questions, because self-regulation, the planning, I think they have, right? The graphic organizer, but I don't even think there's a really understood how to even use the graphic organizer. It becomes more of a, this is a cutesy graphic organizer, rather than we're trying to build like a metacognitive framework for kids to work from. And then within that, the whole premise of self-regulation, I think they recognize that students don't have the self-regulatory pieces in play, but the idea that there's this think SRSD and all this research behind that, how that should be integrated with the writing. Again, it goes back to how we were trained in college, but, and like Betsy said, if you don't stumble upon this, how do we get there? How do we get there when teachers just don't have any access to this information?
Great question.
I wish I had an answer. This is Leslie. I'm so enjoying listening to every word you say, Adria, that I don't want to say anything, but my only response, and this isn't very hopeful, but like I've been using SRSD for 15 years and there's so much I still need to learn. Like, I don't really know how to teach kids analysis. And the graphic organizer had it build that so that it's a schema that kids actually know how to really use a graphic organizer effectively. Because so many of our kids will build one, put it to the left, and then write their essay as if they're two different things. And how do you teach them that this is the skeleton of your piece? Like, that seems obvious to us as adults, but to them as kids. So all of these pieces that you're bringing up, Rebecca, are big and mysterious. And even when you learn SRSD or learn any self-regulated cognitive strategies association instruction, Carol Sue Engler in your state is a genius on all this. Yeah, she's my fave.
I was just going to say the text analysis, you've got to get Carol Sue and Troy Marigis, they're burn it in something, I can't remember what it's called, but they have that. Slash it and burn it. That's what
So they're great questions, Rebecca. And I just think it's a journey, and we are lucky to have people like you and Adria and Julie who are looking at this, and we can all learn and think and grow together.
Thanks so much, Leslie. Taylor, you had your hand up.
Yes. Hi again. I was just going to say, sorry, that light's really bright behind me. I feel like in my years in the classroom at the elementary level, our writing instruction or curriculum or whatnot, whatever you want to call it, is like this magical process that we try to like impart in children. And it just doesn't work. But it's like, oh, we're going to read a mentor text and we're going to then see how a wonderful writer does it. And then you're going to emulate it. And so I think we really, like in reading and everything, we just need this huge shift to know that we need to be more explicit. We need to teach our kids. Like, and so my writing that I brought for this week was based on writing I did with first graders this week. And so we had read some nonfiction books, and I'm teaching a Mandarin immersion program, so my ELA time is very limited. So I try to connect our reading focus with our writing and whatnot. And so I wanted to take their research on nonfiction books and have them write about it. And I started to think, a lot and more in depth about how am I going to actually do this with these first graders that have limited spelling. They get very frustrated quickly with just, the whole process. And so, so it just really came down to a very simple, like, okay, guys, we're going to just do a quick bubble map to plan out, here's our topic. And we all researched and read different books about turkeys. It's the sign of the times. So we did turkeys, and I said we need to have at least 2 to 3 facts. And then we were very explicit of our topic sentence. And even then, like, I thought about it, what am I going to write? But I brought it down to such their level of, I've learned a lot of facts about turkeys. Let me tell you about facts about turkeys. Of course, I wouldn't write like that in general, but I just felt like it was needed to be so basic, clear cut, no frou-frou, no magic, just, you know what I mean? Bare bones, if that makes sense. So like the question is, what is it like in the field? I think the field is just like, it's lost. We need to have this projected across the world. So we need Adria out there.
No, Taylor, we need you wrapping that up like beyond perfectly in stating the explicit pieces. And I think we need to adjust expectations too, exactly like what you just said, that we don't expect first graders to have academic writing, right?
Right, exactly.
We want to see in full sentences the things that they're thinking. Berninger talks about, if I think it, I can say, if I can think it, I can say it, and if I can say it, I can write it. And so you're writing down those exact things that you want them to think. Thank you for sharing that example. That was beautiful.
And then one of the things I did say when, the kids were like, well, I don't know how to say it. And we talk a lot about complete sentences and that kind of stuff. And so I said, tap each bubble and pretend like you're telling someone the story. So, okay. So the fact, you wrote in this little bubble that they, eat plants, nuts, berries, and bugs or whatever one of the facts was. I said, pretend like you're telling someone else the story already, because when you say it, we speak in complete sentence naturally. So then you're hearing the story that you want to put on. So like we literally had them practice tapping their bubbles to tell their story before they even write it. So they had their plan, they said it kind of out loud orally, and then put it to paper. But again, that was just something that, my school currently, the rest of the first grade traditional classes are all following, my least favorite person, and they're doing, watermelon seed stories because they have to do their writer's workshop model that they've done forever and ever, which is just like this crazy realistic expectation that's not happening. So there's my soapbox.
What a wonderful way to wrap this all up. Thank you, Taylor. I'm inspired.
I'm going to buy this book because I know I have a lot of teachers on my other role right now as MTSS coach of saying, my kid's really struggling with writing. What do I do for writing? And our school's like, we don't have writing intervention, but they don't. But I think that even just purchasing this book and me learning more from you, that we can help implement things.
I'm learning from you, and you're in a perfect position to do that. Yeah, you just need to design a system and coach all your teachers.
So
thank you so much, Taylor. Thank you to everybody else. Rebecca, I'll turn it back to you if you need to do anything to wrap it up.
No, I just a hearty thank you to you and to everyone in their participation, and just one step at a time, 1 minute at a time, one teacher at a time. We just keep changing lives for kids and digging in. So I appreciate everyone being with us here this evening, and we will look forward to you on our next session. Happy holidays, happy Thanksgiving to everyone from myself and the Reading League, and enjoy the rest of your week. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Take care.